The whole situation began with someone who believed manipulation was entertainment. Little comments dropped like traps. Little tests disguised as casual conversations. Little games designed to see how much control they could maintain without ever admitting what they were doing. It worked for a while because the other person carried a gentle heart, one that tried to reason instead of retaliate. But every game drains the spirit it feeds on, and eventually the day came when the rules changed. The one expected to play along finally stopped participating. The atmosphere shifted. The silence sharpened. The responses became slower, clearer, more intentional. What was once manipulation became education. The dynamic flipped, not through aggression, but through awareness. That awareness acted like a lamp shining on every trick. The one who thought they were leading suddenly found themselves exposed under a spotlight they never expected. The shift was subtle at first. No announcements, no dramatic confrontation. Just a different tone in the air. The person who was once confused began seeing pattern. Moments that once caused insecurity now revealed themselves as rehearsed behaviors. Every push, every pull, every withdrawal, every provocation, it all clicked into place. That clarity didn't just break the cycle, it rewrote the entire script. The one who initiated the games did not expect such a shift. They were used to reactions, not lessons. They wanted chaos, but what they encountered instead was someone who had outgrown the entire system. Their games suddenly looked childish, almost embarrassing. And without raising their voice, the other person began teaching through calmness. The lecture began not with words, but with composure. What frightened the one who created the chaos was how quickly the power changed hands. In toxic situations, control thrives when confusion is present. But the moment confusion dissolves, the controller loses their foundation. The person who once absorbed all the emotional noise was now responding with unnerving stillness. That stillness felt like judgment. It felt like insight. It felt like facing a mirror they didn't want to look into. When someone stops reacting, the manipulator becomes the only one exposed. The roles reversed without tension. One side spiraled, and the other side observed. That observation alone became the lesson they never asked for. There is something unsettling about being seen by someone you thought you could deceive. The one who played games felt that discomfort crawl under their skin. Every attempt to provoke suddenly bounced back untouched. Every attempt to create insecurity only revealed their own. The person they underestimated no longer sought reassurance, no longer explained themselves, no longer tried to fix problems that weren't theirs. That detachment created a kind of silence that spoke louder than anger ever could. Inside that silence was a message. Understand. Recognize your behavior. Growth begins when the games end. Friends noticed the shift long before the instigator admitted anything. They saw the calmness developing in the heart that had once been anxious. They noticed the sharper boundaries, the firmer presence. The storyteller in the situation had transformed into someone who turned experience into wisdom. Every conversation carried a new depth. Every glance carried new awareness. The person delivering the lessons wasn't trying to teach. They simply refused to return to the old script. That refusal alone became the curriculum. And the one who thought this was all a game began stumbling, unsure of how to navigate a dynamic no longer ruled by manipulation. The lecture became clearer with each passing day. It wasn't taught through speeches or insults. It was taught through distance, through calm replies, through lack of engagement with drama, through understanding the pattern and refusing to feed it. This kind of lesson does not comfort the one who must receive it. It challenges them. It forces reflection. It reveals everything they tried to hide behind their games. The silence became the teacher. The changes became the chalkboard. And every reaction they expected was replaced with a maturity that shook them quietly. In toxic relationships, the transition from victim to teacher often happens in silence. The heart that once cracked under pressure becomes the mind that observes with clarity. The person who once begged for honesty becomes the one who recognizes truth automatically. And the one who relied on confusion begins choking on their own tactics. That is what happened here. The instigator mistook kindness for naivety. They mistook loyalty for desperation. They mistook patience for ignorance. The lecture taught them otherwise. And for the first time, they realized their games never made them powerful. They only made them predictable. As time passed, the dynamic became undeniable. Every attempt to restart the old cycle fell flat. The storyteller had evolved into someone too grounded to be emotionally manipulated. Their words became fewer but carried more weight. Their presence grew quieter but far more controlled. The instigator felt the distance widening, and that widening felt like a consequence. They finally understood the harm they caused, not through confrontation, but through watching the other person rise into a version of themselves that no longer required permission to exist freely. That kind of growth delivers lessons sharper than any spoken reprimand. In the end, the lecture ended the moment the old roles fell apart. The person who once caused confusion became an afterthought. The one who grew turned the entire experience into strength. The games had no place in this new chapter. What survived was wisdom, self-respect, and clarity. And the instigator, watching from afar, finally grasped what happened. The story they tried to control became the story that unmasked them. The lesson they never wanted became the lesson they needed. The game they started turned into the lecture that humbled them. Awareness arrives quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a light flickering in a room that had been dim for far too long. The shift becomes clear only when the usual emotional traps stop working. Confusion once guided the entire relationship. Misunderstandings were created on purpose. Mixed messages kept the other person unsteady. Silence was used as punishment. Affection was given like currency. The confusion served as a leash. But the moment awareness entered, the dynamic snapped. The same words that once triggered panic now sounded rehearsed. The same excuses that once created guilt now felt predictable. The same cycles that once caused self-doubt now revealed their pattern. Awareness took the place of confusion the way clarity replaces fog, slowly but completely. The person who once stumbled through emotional landmines began stepping around them with effortless precision. The transformation didn't begin with confidence. It began with exhaustion. There comes a point in every toxic dynamic where the emotional fatigue becomes heavier than the attachment. In that moment of heaviness, awareness slips in like a breath of fresh air. It shows the difference between love and dependency. It highlights how often boundaries were crossed. It reveals how many apologies were demanded without sincerity. Confusion used to blur these observations, but awareness made everything painfully clear. It didn't make the person harder, it made them smarter. They started connecting dots they once ignored. They noticed tone shifts. They noticed patterns. They noticed manipulation where they previously saw misunderstanding. That recognition reshaped everything. Awareness also softened the emotional reactions that once fed the toxic cycle. Arguments no longer escalated because the heart stopped responding from a wounded place. Silence no longer created panic because the mind recognized it as a tactic. Sudden affection no longer felt comforting because the pattern behind it was finally understood. The person who once craved reassurance now craved honesty. The one who once accepted excuses began analyzing intentions. The emotional shifts were subtle but powerful. Awareness replaced confusion in a way that made the old version of them seem distant, almost unrecognizable. The person who once lived in emotional chaos now moved through conversations with calm reason. The one playing games felt the change before they understood it. They sensed the distance. They sensed the shift in tone. They sensed the lack of fear. Confusion had been their greatest weapon because it allowed them to twist narratives at will. But once awareness settled in, every tactic became transparent. Every guilt trip sounded scripted. Every sudden apology felt hollow. Every dramatic outburst looked theatrical. The power once drawn from confusion vanished instantly. Awareness does not fight. Awareness does not argue. It simply sees. And being seen unsettles the person who depended on confusion to stay in control. There's a moment in toxic situations when the person who used to be emotionally tangled suddenly begins thinking clearly. They start asking themselves questions they once avoided. Why do I feel drained after every conversation? Why do the apologies never match their actions? Why am I explaining myself to someone who never listens? These questions become the foundation of awareness. The heart that once needed reassurance begins seeking truth instead. The confusion that once came from emotional instability is replaced with a sharp understanding of behavior. When awareness settles in, The emotional grip breaks without dramatic confrontation. It breaks silently through insight. The shift affects everyday moments too. The same phrases that once triggered anxiety now hold no power. The same patterns that once blinded the heart now reveal the manipulator instead. The person who once chased clarity now walks away from chaos without hesitation. Confusion used to feel normal. Awareness makes it impossible to accept again. The relationship no longer feels like a mystery to solve. It becomes a situation to walk away from. And that shift is devastating for the one who depended on emotional fog to maintain control. They feel the loss of influence long before the relationship ends. Awareness also changes how the wounded person sees themselves. Instead of feeling too emotional, they recognize emotional intelligence. Instead of feeling too sensitive, they recognize intuition. Instead of blaming themselves for imbalance, they see how the other person created it. Awareness becomes self-respect in motion. And self-respect is something a manipulator cannot withstand. It creates a boundary that no guilt or anger can penetrate. Confusion used to keep the heart small. Awareness helps it expand until it no longer fits inside the relationship that once confined it. The person delivering the games begins losing control, not because the other person becomes cold, but because they become clear. Clarity is the antidote to manipulation. It reveals the truth beneath the performance. The manipulator begins scrambling, offering sudden affection, sudden apologies, sudden explanations. But awareness makes those gestures appear transactional. The heart no longer falls for what the mind now understands. Every attempt to restart the old pattern becomes a lesson instead of a trap. In this way, awareness becomes a lecture the manipulator never asked for, yet cannot escape. The story reaches its turning point when the once confused person begins trusting their perceptions again. They stop seeking validation from the one who caused the confusion. They stop shrinking to keep the peace. They stop avoiding reality. Awareness gives them courage, not loud courage, but steady courage. The kind that whispers in the morning, walk differently. The kind that whispers at night, this cycle is done. The manipulator senses this shift deeply because it means the emotional leash has snapped. Without confusion, they have nothing left to control.